I hope everyone is doing well. I get the privilege after Sundays of occasionally receiving some encouraging emails from people. One of them that I often get encouraging emails from is a guy named Dewey Garton, who is Andrew Garton's, Elizabeth Garton's husband's dad. And they live in Tennessee, and he always sends me a joke. And last week after the sermon, he sent me a joke. And essentially, it was about a place that my dad actually retired from 37 years of the aviation industry. And so Dewey said that this company was developing a new airplane that cannot crash. It's made from rubber polymers, so it'll just bounce instead of crash. And the aircraft is, of course, invented by Boeing. I know. But I still laugh. But so we've been in this series in the life of David, right? And last weekend we saw his life and Saul's life really come crashing down. But it's all about what you're made of and who you turn to that decides whether or not you will bounce back when your life comes crashing down. And what's so interesting in David's life, and last week I entitled the sermon, The Rise of David, and the rise, of course, was in quotes, because David's ascension to the throne actually begins with God removing every crutch and prop that David had in his life that he was leaning on up to that point. David had his position in the military, his job removed. He had his wife removed from him for a long time. He had his mentor, Samuel, removed from him. He had his best friend removed from him. And finally, he had his self-respect removed from him, all in one fell swoop. This was his rise to the throne. Now, we saw how God used this tragedy in his life to actually teach David to fully rely on him. That's what God did with this circumstance in his life. And we also learned that losing our crutches, the things we lean on in our life, it can be painful. It can be extremely painful. But God is faithful to use those painful things in our lives to prepare us, I believe, to fully serve him in a better way. And so David is now a fugitive in Israel. He's on the run. He's on the lam from Saul. And he has to, every person in his life at this point that he has gone to and run to provide for him in this terrible moment in his life, it gets all stripped away. So he runs to all these people. He even runs to his enemy in Gath. This is Goliath's hometown to seek refuge. But you can imagine that the giant slayer is not welcome in Gath, and so David feigns this insanity, and he narrowly escapes from Gath, and he finds this place of refuge. And so we're going to pick up the story in 1 Samuel 22. We're going to be through 24 this morning, 22 through 24 of 1 Samuel, so keep your thumbs in your Bibles there. 1 Samuel 22, starting in verse 1, it says this. It says, David left Gath. That's where Goliath was from. And he escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. I think it's so interesting how the tables have turned here for David and his family. David and his own family, he was not held in high esteem at all, right? His brothers, especially when he goes out to fight or to see what's going on with Goliath and the Philistines, they kind of show their true colors about how they feel about him when he's going down there and how they treat him. And now somehow, through the secret networks, I'm not sure how, they actually find out that he's at this cave called the Cave of Adullam. Of course, David's family, they can't stay in Bethlehem. Why? Because of Saul. If they stay in Bethlehem, Saul will eventually find them, use them to either coax David back to kill him, or he'll just kill David's family, right? And so they can't stay there anymore. They've gone to David at this cave of Adullam. In addition to his father's household coming to this cave at Adullam, those who were in distress, those who were in debt, those who were discontent, they joined him there. Now, this just goes to show, I think, the kind of kingdom that disobedient Saul is leading. Saul is disobedient to what God is asking him to do, and I think his kingdom suffered for it. And I think that's why there's so many people who were in this circumstance because of Saul's leadership. So it says that there were people who had to take debts on. Essentially, I think inflation was high. I think they had to go and get creditors. And what's so strange is that in Israel, you were not allowed to lend to someone with interest, right? But I think that's what's going on here. I think that's in Exodus 22, verse 5, if you want to look that up. But there were people discontent with how things were. Inflation's so high, they have to take loans out from other people. They're getting charged interest. Things are bad where they're at. And so these people who've heard about David, they find him somehow. They find him in this cave of Adullam through these secret networks. And David there becomes their commander. It's in the cave of Adullam where David gathers his legendary mighty men, spoken about in 2 Samuel chapter 23. And I just tell you, I love reading about these guys. I love reading about David's mighty men. Starts here, we'll start in verse 8 of 23 of 2 Samuel. These are the names of David's mighty warriors. Josheb-Bashabeth, a Tehukamonite. I think I said that right. I probably didn't, actually. He was chief of the three. There's 3 out of 34 or 37. I can't remember. He raised his spear against 800 men. 800 men whom he killed in one encounter. Can you believe that? That is an incredible, incredible guy. Next to him was Eleazar, son of Dodai, the Ahohite. As one of the 3 mighty warriors, he was with David when they taunted the Philistines, gathered at Posdamim for battle. Then the Israelites retreated. But Eleazar stood his ground and struck down the Philistines till his hand grew tired and froze to the sword. He was fighting so hard, his hand froze to the sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day. The troops returned to Eleazar, but only to strip the dead. Abishai, the brother of Joab, son of Zeruiah, was chief of the 3. He raised his spear against 300 men, whom he killed, and so he became as famous as the 3. Was he not held in greater honor than the 3? He became their commander, even though he was not included among them. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, a valiant fighter from Kabzeel, performed great exploits. He struck down Moab's 2 mightiest warriors. He also went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. And he struck down a huge Egyptian. Although the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. And David put him in charge of his bodyguard. I'd want that guy next to me too. Among the 30 were Asahel, the brother of Joab, Elhanan, son of Dodo from Bethlehem, Ira the Ithrite, Gareb the Ithrite. So it goes through all these people that are part of the mighty men. And then it says, verse 39, it ends with this name. Do you recognize it? Uriah the Hittite. Did you know that Uriah the Hittite was one of David's mighty men? I had forgotten about that, which adds more to the story that we will get to when we get to that part. There were 37 in all. The cave of Adullam is a place where David took refuge, and God brought him the very beginning seed of his kingdom that he will start out with. David is kind of like Robin Hood and his merry men in Sherwood Forest, only it's these caves in Adullam. And David trained his men there. And here's what I mean by trained his men. We have multiple psalms that David wrote while he was in this cave. And Psalm 34 is one of them. I want you to notice this, verse 3. It says, "Glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together." Well, who do you think David is talking to here if he's writing from the cave? He is talking and teaching his men. In the midst of being a fugitive, he wants his men to know that they need to give glory to God, to trust in God. Even when you are in a dark place, put your hope in God. This is what he's teaching his men. Not just how to fight, not just how to do battle, but he's teaching them to place their hope in God. Then you have in verse 5 of 34, those who look to him are radiant, their faces never covered with shame. This poor man called, and the Lord heard him. He saved him out of all his troubles. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. He trained the people under him not just to do battle, but to trust in God and worship God. They say that David stayed in Adullam, that cave, for about 9 months, about the time that it takes to develop something new, right? And that's when God tells him to move on. 1 Samuel 22, verse 3. From there, David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, "Would you please let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me?" So he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David was in the stronghold, which is another place. David takes care of his aging father and his aging mother, and he sends them to Moab. Why Moab? Why Moab? Because Moab is family. Moab is family. If you were here for the very first sermon, you would remember that David's great-grandmother was Ruth, who was a Moabitess. Perhaps they have some relatives in that region. I don't really know. But for the time being, his family was safe there. And then all of a sudden, we kind of have this Melchizedek moment with another priest type. And he comes on the scene in verse 5. It says this, but the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Go into the land of Judah." So David left and went to the forest of Hereth. Well, who is this prophet Gad? Where does he come from? We don't really have all the answers to this, but he shows up in David's life a few times. He shows up right here, but notably, he shows up at the end of David's story when David sinfully takes a census of his army in 1 Chronicles 21. He's this brave prophet of God who will boldly tell David what God tells him to tell David. And he's there in his early and late years of his life, and then we're not sure where he's at after that. But he's this prophet of God that's been hanging around David named Gad. Now, David is really like Robin Hood because now he's in a forest, the forest of Hereth. And it says this in 22:14. David stayed in the wilderness, strongholds, and in the hills of the desert of Sif. And it's in the deserts of Sif and the wilderness that Jonathan, his true best friend, will visit him for the very last time and speak many words of encouragement to him. One of those encouraging words is a reminder that Jonathan believed that God was going to make David king over Israel. And in a sense, Jonathan is prophesying about David that he will, in fact, be king over Israel. He's saying this is a true statement, but he's kind of he has imperfect foresight because Jonathan, he says, you're going to be king and I will be your viceroy, meaning I will be your second in command. Unfortunately, this will never happen. Jonathan will never get a chance to be David's second in command, although that was the hope that they had, probably together. But this meeting strengthened David's resolve because David was reminded by Jonathan that God will keep his promise to you. And I think that brought David much, much courage. And he would need it because Jonathan's daddy Saul was getting closer and closer and closer to capturing this fugitive and his ragtag group of disgruntled Israelites. And while David is hiding in the mountains of Arabah, Saul closes in so closely that he's literally on the other side of this mountain, this small mountain. Maybe we might call it a hill. But he's on the other side, opposite of David and his group. And here's what happens in 23, verse 26. Saul was going along one side of the mountain, and David and his men were on the other side, hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his forces were closing in on David and his men to capture them, a messenger came to Saul saying, "Come quickly, the Philistines are raiding the land." Then Saul broke off his pursuit of David and went to meet the Philistines. That is why they call this place Selah Hamalakath. And David went up from there. And David went up from there, and he lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. Now, I'm not allowed to use the Lord of the Rings references, but maybe once or twice a year, and so I'm using it here. But I think this is definitely one of those Frodo and Sam moments where they're so close to being caught by, Sauron, and they're trying to bring the Ring of Power to Mordor, but Aragorn, he decides to do a distraction. And so he comes up and he brings his army right to the gates of Mordor. And the eye of Sauron focuses on Aragorn. And that way Frodo and Sam can actually get to the top of the mountain and go and destroy the ring unnoticed. That's exactly what happens here with David and Saul. And it makes you ponder why the Lord allows the chase to get so close. Why does he allow it to get so close? Perhaps to show that it wasn't really David who got away. It was the Lord who delivered him. And to this day, they call that rock that they were on, Selah Hamalakath, the rock of escape, or the rock of parting. 1 Samuel 24, 1 through 2. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats there. Now, En-Gedi means spring of the goat. There are springs there in this place, but I'm told that En-Gedi is a vast wilderness full of rocks, full of mountain goats, and caves. Caves large enough to hold several thousand people. At this point, David has acquired up to 600 people in his band of misfits, but these caves in En-Gedi, they would have been easily large enough to hold all of those 600 people. I saw one person that I read, he said that they could fit up to 300,000 people in one cave. That seems like a lot to me. I don't know how that is, but that's what I read. So that's, I think, why this happened at this point. 1 Samuel 24, verse 3. He, Saul, came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave, and the men said, This is the day the Lord spoke of, when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. If you've ever wondered if the Bible is true, this verse, I think, proves it is true. These stories really happen. We learn that Saul goes into the very cave that David and his men are hiding in to relieve himself. Can you see this picture here? Don't think about it too long. I know you're laughing on the inside. Don't think about it too long. But Saul's on his haunches, looking out of the cave and taking care of business, and David sneaks up behind him, and he snips off a corner of the edge of his robe. He can't bring himself to actually kill Saul. He can't do it, so he snips off a corner of his robe instead. And you would think he would rejoice at being so stealthy and being able to get that close without his enemy even knowing about it. But yet, actually, it has the opposite effect on him. 24, verse 5. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went on his way. Now, I'm no Hebrew scholar, but I've read that word, that term for sharply rebuke his men, it actually means, it's a term for tearing them apart. He tore them apart. Let me ask you, do you think David's men were happy that David let Saul get away at this moment? Do you think that they were excited that he actually gave Saul a second chance? I think they're thinking, what in the world are you thinking, David? We are sick and tired of being hunted. We've been on the lam for months and months and months, running and living in caves. How dare you not take the opportunity to kill your enemy that God has clearly placed before you to kill? David had immense pressure to exact revenge on his enemy when he was in his most vulnerable state. And he had to talk his men down. And he had to tell them what I learned from watching Band of Brothers. In Band of Brothers, Easy Company of the 101st Airborne, they have a very strict and hard drill sergeant whom everyone hated. They all hated him. They disliked him. And they did everything that he asked. They went through all of his shenanigans until he proved at one point that he couldn't lead them out in enemy territory, actually out on a mission. He proved that he couldn't do it with a map and a compass. And long story short, one of the men in the Easy Company gets promoted above the drill sergeant, and he takes the lead, and now the drill sergeant's underneath him, and that former drill sergeant won't salute him. So what's the line that he says to the drill sergeant? Do you guys remember, those who have seen it? He says, "You salute the rank, not the man." You remember that? You salute the rank, not the man. And I think that's what David taught his men here. That regardless if Saul was living right in obedience to God's will, he was the Lord's anointed. And that meant something to David. That he would not let his men attack the Lord's anointed. You honor the rank, even if you don't honor the man. 1 Samuel 24:8. Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My Lord, the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. And he said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say, 'David is bent on harming you'? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, 'I will not lay my hand on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed.' See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers comes evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me and deliver me from your hand." What is David doing here? When wrong is being done towards David, I'll tell you what he's doing. When wrong is done towards David, when wrong is done towards you, I think it's still necessary, regardless of what's going on in the situation, regardless if you can actually retaliate, it's still necessary to tell that person the truth of what's going on. Tell them the truth. You and I are responsible to declare the truth to whoever our enemy might be who is opposing us and oppressing us. You know, our tendency is to say, "Oh, it's just, let it lie, leave it alone, it'll work out." But David didn't leave it alone. He didn't let it lie. David said to King Saul, "Saul, you're listening to false counsel. You're listening to lies. People are telling you lies about me. Here's proof about it. Why do you listen to them?" And he declares the truth to Saul, even though there was no retaliation against him. And here is Saul's response, verse 16 of 24. When David finished saying this, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family." And so David gave his oath to Saul. And then Saul returned home, but David and his men, they went up to the stronghold. Years later, we will see that David actually keeps this oath to Saul. He keeps his promise. But he doesn't go back home with Saul because he's too wise for that. And he was right to do that because before long, Saul will once again turn on David and try and kill him again. But that's our text for this morning. What can we learn from the life of David as a fugitive? And I think the first thing that we learn is this, that we need a harbor of refuge. We need a harbor of refuge. Where do you turn when the bottom drops out of your life? There is this prevailing theology in Christianity that after you become a Christian, life is just full of silver linings and sunshine and rainbows and everything's perfect. But the reality is sometimes we find ourselves seeking out a place of refuge in dark and lonely times of our life. That's what David had to do. That's what David did. He had to find refuge in this cave. And David, I think, was honest enough that when he went there, he was honest enough to actually cry for help in the cave. He actually asked God for help. How many times have we gone to these places and we've been too stubborn to ask for help? And he was humble enough to learn from God in that cave. He learned from God. David allowed that 9 months in the cave of Adullam for God to train him and for God to surround him with people in his life to support him. He allowed God to do that in his life. He could have fought it. He could have whined about it. He could have cursed it. But instead, he let God minister to him there, and he obeyed him there. Let me ask you again, where do you turn when the bottom drops out of your life and you find yourself in sorrow and in sin, depressed, despairing, and rejected, and lonely? You're in a dark place. That's where David was. And here's who he turned to. He wrote these words while in that cave, Psalm 57. He said, "Have mercy on me, my God. Have mercy on me. For in you I take refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed." God became David's refuge more than the cave did itself. In fact, in other Psalms, he will call God my strength, my mighty rock, my fortress, my stronghold, my high tower. Why not share David's shelter with David? Because we all need a harbor of refuge at times, and God is better than any fortress that we can run to. I think we also learn from David's time as a fugitive that we needn't harbor desires of revenge. What would you have done, given the chance to exact revenge on your enemy like David had? Have you had some people in your life throw some spears at you? Have you had some people in your life that you'd like to throw some spears back at? You bet you have. Most of the movies that we watch actually teach us this, and they glorify this. One of my favorite movies is called The Count of Monte Cristo. It's about a guy getting revenge on his friend who's done him wrong, and by the end of the movie, you are rooting for him to get this guy back, right? It's one of my favorites, and that's the moral of it. But men and women of God, men and women after God's own heart, they act differently than the world, don't they? David was bothered in his conscience by just cutting off a corner of Saul's robe by that act. So Chuck Swindoll, he tells the story of a guy who used to think, who cares if you take a little bit from the company? If they got so much, they make $800,000 in profit last year. They won't miss these stamps. They won't miss these few pieces of stationery. And after his friend began to walk with the Lord in earnest, he said, when I got to the place that I couldn't even take a paper clip, I knew that God had really gone deep into my life. People may think you're crazy to not retaliate against someone who's hurt you. They will even give you advice to strike when your enemy is most vulnerable. You know, they hurt you. Just wait for them to slip up. Or they say the wrong thing and use their words against them, or call them out in front of everyone and embarrass them. Everyone is telling you that's what they deserve, and your own flesh is even telling you that's what they deserve. But then you remember Jeb's lesson on David. And you remember what Paul said in Romans 12, more likely. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I'll repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Let me ask you a question. When is it right for a Christian to exact revenge on somebody? When is it right to repay evil for evil as a Christian? Now, I'm not talking about our national defense, our enemies on the borders, and we need to protect our borders, or standing up for what's right and protecting another person in self-defense, but I'm asking, when is it right for a Christian to exact revenge on somebody? The Bible is very clear. Never. Never. Not usually, not sometimes, not occasionally, not even once. We leave room for God to protect us, for God to deliver us from the situation. The only being allowed to take revenge that's spoken of in the Bible is the Lord, because He will do it in righteousness. It will be right when He does it. Jesus teaches in Matthew 5, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. What would it look like for you today to do good to someone who's been evil towards you? What would that look like? What would it look like for you to pray for someone who has hurt you? Could you do that? Because that's the only course of action that God prescribes in the Bible, to do good and pray and wait for God to avenge us. And that actually leads to the last point this morning, that we need to have faith in God's revealed timing. When David brings his parents to the king of Moab, in verse 3 it says, would you let my father and mother come and stay with you? And then it says this, until I learn what God will do for me. And that's the first time in the story that we see David saying that he will wait for God's timing. After that, David really just resigns himself to the fact that God will bring justice to Saul in God's timing. It would not be by his own hand that Saul would die. It would be by God doing it. And David didn't know when this game of cat and mouse would end. He didn't know the end of the story, but he would let God deal with his enemy in his own time. David, in the cave of Adullam, he surrenders himself to God's plans. And David only narrowly escapes capture numerous times there, narrowly escapes, and it's not till the very last moment in several situations before God will deliver him, and that's how he's had to live his life. But he surrenders to that life because he's willing to wait on God's timing to bring him to the throne and not his own. Whatever would happen, David won't take Saul's life. He says in 24:15, may the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May He consider my cause and uphold it. May He vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. David would wait for God to vindicate him and deliver Saul into his hand, which means that he's going to let Saul live. He's going to let him live. And he knows that he will have to trust in God every time he lets Saul live. A little bit later on, he actually has the same opportunity to spare Saul's life. He does it again, and guess what that means? It means that he, for weeks after weeks, months after months, years after years, will have to wait for God's promise to vindicate him. We don't know exactly how long David ran from Saul, but it was believed to be somewhere between 7 and 15 years. 7 and 15 years that he's running from Saul and waiting for God's timing. Have you ever done that? Waited that long for God to vindicate you? It's hard. It's hard to wait that long for something, especially for deliverance from your enemy. David will later write in Psalm 25, verse 20, "Oh, guard my soul and deliver me. Let me not be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. May integrity and uprightness preserve me, for I wait for you." So I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what's been your week, your month, your past year. I don't know what you're going through, but if you, like David, you're in despair, and you have an enemy chasing you down, or a problem in your life that is too difficult to overcome, David's time as a fugitive teaches us to turn to God and to wait for Him to deliver us, to run to Him, the one that David called my strength, my mighty rock, my fortress, my stronghold, my high tower. And we know Him today as Jesus. And He's available to you today to place your hope in Him, to be baptized into the name of Jesus this morning, our rock of refuge. Or maybe this morning you need to start praying with one of us. Pray with one of the elders in the front and back, or pray with someone in room 9 with our prayer team, because you've been relying on you for too long. And you've maybe been in that dark place for a long time, but you haven't really turned and cried out to God for help. You haven't allowed God to teach you what you need to learn, and you need the help of the Lord to turn your heart, to stop trusting yourself and trust Him. You can pray with one of us this morning. Whatever your need may be, we want you to respond this morning to the message. You can come to the front or go to the back. Whatever your need may be, please come while we stand and sing this closing song. Please come.